Welcome back to Defence Talk, Securing UK Advantage, a podcast brought to you by the Council on Geostrategy in partnership with trade association ADS Group and sponsored by industry powerhouse BAE Systems. Shortly after taking office in July 2024, the Labour government and Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer launched the Strategic Defence Review with the aim of setting out a new vision for defence in the UK. Now, this review was led by 3 reviewers, including Claude Robertson, Dr. Fiona Hill and General Barons, and throughout the process they engaged extensively with allies, partners, industry and wider society. So the SDI is finally out, Paul. Yes, and I'm still digesting it, I have to say. I've been writing my column in the New European about the nuclear aspect of it. So a lot of the other stuff looks a bit hazy to me, and I'm hoping our guests, who we'll introduce in a minute, will throw some light on it. Well, the SDR will certainly shape the future course of UK defence, and today we will examine the implications of this review for industry and international alliances and our military. But most importantly, we will also look at the practical steps required to implement its vision. Now, I'm Viktorija Starych-Samuolienė, co-founded the Council on Geostrategy, and I'm joined by Paul Mason, as always, and we have 2 guests today with us in the studio. So Craven became CEO of ADS Group in April 2021, having served as a member of the ADS board for 3 years, including as ADS Vice President Defence. And Air Marshal Ed Stringer is Director at IG7 and a Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange. He is also a retired Senior Royal Air Force Officer and Director General of the Defence Academy. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into it. What are the first impressions?
I'm happy to go first. Look, I liked it. I think it's a solid piece of work. And in terms of the recommendations, there's not much that you can argue with. However, the dependencies are many and manifest in terms of both the resources to implement it and the effectiveness of the defence reform, both on the MOD and the industry side, to make it real.
Thank you, Kevin. Edward?
Yeah, well, in my last job, I was Director General Joint Force Development as well, so the licensed futurologist, and actually worked very closely on several tours with, and originally for, Richard Barons. So I'm going to say that I like a heck of a lot of the vision in it, and immediately I'm going to say that the whole thing's written, if you like, in a sort of conditional tense. You know, if, when, and depending on. And so I think the sceptics will look at it and say, well, it sounds great, but where's the beef? So if you're talking about implementation, I think that's the key thing to get to grips with. Then I'm going to say you almost need to think about looking at things in reverse and look at the boring stuff in it. Things that Kevin, spoken about in the past. How are you going to build a defence industrial base? Let's not try and chase some quick wins. Let's look at skills. Let's look at you mentioned nuclear. What is the national nuclear enterprise like if you've got this level of ambition? Have you got the academic base? Have you got the industrial base for it? And that's going to be the test as to whether the government is coming at this as a real whole of government national security mindset, because that's what would underpin what's on the opening page. Times are serious. We need a serious response.
As somebody who tries to explain these to a general audience at these moments, what I've been saying is, look, it doesn't matter whether it's 2.5% or 3% if the deterrent doesn't deter. And one way of reading this document is, it starts with nuclear. Very obviously, it starts with nuclear, and it just says, here's what we're going to do, some big stuff. I think for the public, what we need to get across is the idea that by focusing on the big strategic stuff, they are basically trying to create an insurance policy against any further deterioration in the global situation, about which, of course, the SDR is itself pretty negative.
So there are 5 key elements which have been outlined also on the official website dedicated to the SDR, and these are the following: move to warfighting readiness, engine for growth, NATO first, UK innovation driven by lessons from Ukraine, and whole of society approach. So I think some of these we've already touched on very briefly, but let's try to unpack the boring stuff, as Ed, you've just referred to it. Kevin, what does this SDR mean for our industry?
So what I liked about it was the actual 10-year vision, which provided a degree of certainty that will help with industrial planning. So the number of warships, an extra number of destroyers and frigates, nuclear submarines, essentially means one warship every year for the next couple of decades. If true and if affordable, then that will provide an absolute boost to productivity in shipbuilding in the UK. And there's other examples of that written across the document, which talks about always on production, whereas we stop buying in dribs and drabs, buy 1,000 of one thing, then not order it again for the next 5 years. Let's rather buy 100 at a time for the next 10 years in a row. So there are elements of the plan that will allow improvements in industrial productivity, which I think will be good. I think the focus on some of the new tech, the SMEs, the routes to the innovation hub, all of these things are going to be very welcomed by, our 1,300 SME members as well. So I think there are some elements of it that are really good. We are waiting with bated breath for the appointment of the National Armaments Director, a figure from industry, we hope, who will be able to build that relationship with industry, sometimes called the sixth domain. I'm not sure I really like that phrase, but it's helpful in terms of in today's modern warfare, you do need a strong, capable, high-capacity industry to fight a modern war.
And Ed, what does this SDR mean for our military?
It's going to generally have to start thinking in a more integrated way, and it's going to have to think about what the flip side of the relationship is between the NAD and the other major part of defence reform, which is the military strategic headquarters. So at the moment, to simplify it, given the time, you essentially have the services are the driving force behind what they're going to be in the future. And that's sort of intuitive, I think, to most members of the population. Of course, the Navy will develop what the Navy is going to be. But you can end up with three, from their own perspectives, perfect services who can only loosely operate together, let alone execute an integrated war plan, which this calls for, across 5 domains, including space and including cyber, which definitely are warfighting domains at the moment. So what it means for the services now is they are going to have to work for Chief of Defence Staff running his military strategic headquarters. This would be a commonplace if you were in Finland or one of those countries just sitting across the border from Russia. And the National Armaments Director will be providing the materiel to the military strategic headquarters to be able to execute those war plans. They will then be carved up and given to Army, Navy, Air Force, whose job will now be not to spend most of its life trying to work out what it wants and arguing to go and buy it, but it's going to be given the stuff and they've got to work out how to extract the most combat power from that as efficiently as possible, which once again is actually what services have traditionally done in wartime. Commanders-in-chief get given the materiel that the alliance can afford to build, and they have to still go and defeat the enemy with it. They don't spend their lives trying to work out what the optimum kit list is to put in the shop window. Once again, that's a reflection, I think, of the seriousness that runs through the SDR, which is we have to think about real war at scale, war at speed, and how you'd mobilise a nation to do it. So it's a fundamental shift of focus for our armed forces, and one which, if I was starting my career again, I would welcome.
There's a challenge, though, isn't there? If you think about the way the general public is thinking, they'll hear this word war-fighting readiness, and it may be a little bit of a mystery to them about what that means. And I'm wondering whether you could throw any light on that, Edward, about what would Royal Air Force be doing differently to today if it was truly war-fighting ready?
Yeah, it is a very good question, because actually our services are at readiness at the moment. But that readiness is scaled. It's kept very secret, which is why the public doesn't really know about it. But some of our forces are at, say, R2, which is a couple of days' notice to be able to go to war. Some are at R5, which is, don't say how much it is, but might be months, which is months to get ready to go and fight. What that depends on, though, is actually having stuff in the locker.
Yeah.
And so you've also got, behind that readiness, you've got planning assumptions. So even forces at high readiness, it's a little bit moot as to how ready they really are. Because readiness for what? And there's a difference between even something like the Falklands, which was when I just about starting my career. There was a difference between readiness to execute the plans in the Cold War, which is probably closest to what we're talking about now. But the sort of readiness to execute some of the rather small-scale operations has not required us to actually have huge amounts of kit in the locker, as countries like Finland do, and a defence industry ready to be mobilised behind, such that if you go into a confrontation, and of course this actually does, to your point, it changes the conditions as to what you're actually practicing for and what you're checking every day. And it means more of an emphasis on what traditionally, as I say, I like the phrase boring war, but it's the logistic stuff, and less of an emphasis on the sexy war, which is doing the high-end practice combat that most of the front line enjoys.
Kevin, what would it mean for industry then? What kind of step change do we expect industry to be having to make if this gets executed right?
I'll take it a bit further in terms of saying neither industry nor the broader society is actually at any state of readiness in terms of that. Industry's got better over the last 2 or 3 years. Ukraine has been helpful both to understand how industry can play a bigger part, but also in terms of what is required in terms of agility and pace in terms of fighting that modern war. So there's a number of things around resilience. So a good example might be, I was talking with some Ukrainian colleagues around the 155mm factory, and literally 3 days later had been blown up by a Russian cruise missile. So the ability of the industry to be resilient in the face of actual kinetic attacks is something that we have to look at. We also have to look at the skill sets and the capacity. At the moment, we have something like 165,000 employees across the defence industry, but we cannot fulfil the orders that we already have in time. So we've got a skills gap, we have a volume gap, same as the military forces, by the way, that we need to address. And some of that is about our politicians taking on this subject and talking a little bit more about the threat level rather than the defence dividend. So defence dividend will follow, but we actually have got to build the appetite for a greater level of defence spending.
I've read the SDR and I think it offers a great vision as to what we want to achieve and where we want to be. But the problem that I have with this document when I read it is how are we going to pay for it? And can we really achieve this with the current commitment when it comes to our defence spending? So we currently spend 2.3%. We know that this will increase to 2.5 by 2027. And then hopefully by the time the next parliament is in place, we will be spending 3%. But is this really enough? Is this sufficient?
No, and we are currently, the current NAD tells me at 2.38% actually. So
that's good.
Which is good. But the reality is that 2.5% will not be enough. I think everybody knows it, and the response to most of the commentary has been about where's the money coming from. So both from a military point of view in terms of the planning assumptions that we need to do the force and capability development, but from an industrial development point of view, we need that certainty that night will follow day and orders will follow the money being made available to do this. So there is a little bit of hope because understanding the Prime Minister's political challenges, we've been in this place before where the equivocation around increasing the spend to 2.5% kept us waiting for months and then finally happened. I am hoping that that is the case at the moment, that we're in that sort of phony war stage of building the political and Treasury consensus around the requirement to spend 3% by the time we get to the 2030 and potentially 3.5 by 2035. It's absolutely necessary.
How do we achieve this?
Okay, well, I'm a bit of a heretic on this, so turn it into a podcast so we're not all totally agreeing with each other. But I will say, I think you're probably right, it will be more, but I think there is a conditional step that we, and by we I'm thinking mostly the military, does have to go through, because what you've just described there is a complete headache for the Treasury.
It is.
And for this government looking across the board at all sorts of services in this country. So we in the defence establishment can't make a case to just go for another whole % of GDP, say, because that's the rate of bang for the buck that you get out of the current system. And you've got to look at the amount we have, 2.38, you just said, of GDP, and for that the British Army has 14 155mm howitzers. This is ludicrous.
It is ludicrous, and the requirement that we all understand and see is very different from the ability to resource against that requirement. And I hate to say the words, I agree with you. We do need to make the case to the wider public in order that the Treasury understands the necessity to fund this. But it's not going to be easy, it's not going to be simple, and we have to have a little bit of sympathy and empathy for the politicians in making their case. Help them make the case as well.
Yes, but I'd also come back to the point we made earlier about joined up government, because of course it's been some Treasury rules that have rather encouraged people to get rid of stuff in the past, because you have to keep on depreciating it. You have resource accounting budgets and this, that and the other. I was on the Air Force Board 10 years ago when the Air Force Board was seriously trying to get rid of Storm Shadow missiles, given the operational context at the time, which was all Iraq and Afghanistan, because it was costing so much to both in pure environmental storage of these things and also where they sat in the ledger and how much they were nominally costing. Set against that, someone like a country like Finland stockpiles and keeps stockpiling, and even though some of its stuff might now be considered slightly second tier, they still have, I think it's well over 1,000 artillery pieces. Contrast that with our 14. Their defence budget is a seventh of ours, about that. So we need to look at what are all the conditions that apply across government, what are we encouraging, how are we incentivising? And how would we look at what the Ukrainians have just done over the weekend against Russian long-range aviation? Can you imagine writing a contract for that under the old paradigm and saying, okay, X Squadron RAF is now going to have 20 trucks and it's going to be this, and you need a different way of thinking about how you resource. Yeah, but the trouble is they'd be painted sort of light blue or dark green and have an RAF written down the side. The whole thing wouldn't work. But I think you get my point. What I'm trying to say is, when it comes to war fighting, and you said, Paul, earlier on, how is this different for the services? Well, one of the ways is we have to get back to that great dictum of Colonel John Boyd. He said, people, ideas, machines, and in that order. And what you've seen in Ukraine is the right sort of people, and that's intelligence agencies, special forces, the tech sector, coming together to have a great idea that we've just seen enacted over this weekend. That's the idea, and then across society they've come up with the material to make it work. And look what they've done, taken about a third of the, apparently, have been still to confirmed, of Russia's strategic long-range bomber force. It's incredible.
Yep.
Now, how would you, under our previous paradigm, come up with that capability and put it on a shelf? You wouldn't, but we've got all the constituent parts in the country to do it. We just haven't really practiced it or thought about how we pull it together in wartime. So those are the things that need, I would argue, need to come out of the SDR. We need to create the culture that can be as innovative as the Ukrainians, not try and say, well, what do those drones look like? Let's go and buy 50 and put them on a shelf, because that's not how it works.
There was a boring part of the SDR that spoke about reducing the defence safety standards and in evaluating new capabilities, which is exactly what Ed is talking about in terms of how the Ukrainians approach something. To evaluate a new drone capability, put it on the front line, takes about 6 weeks. To adapt it on the battlefield takes about 5 or 6 days. We probably would take a couple of years to do that at the moment. So we've got to change and change quickly.
And how quickly can this change realistically?
So I'm really pleased to say last year I took 14 companies on my first trade mission into Ukraine. This just come back, 55 companies went in. So there is a growing understanding and awareness and visibility of how they're doing that. Translating that here, I think there's an industrial willingness. What we will hope to see with the new MOD industrial partnership is greater flexibility about how we move that partnership forward.
There is a heck of a lot of spending and signalling going on into the strategic end of specifically maritime. We've got GCAP, great. but we're talking about a lot of attack submarines. We're talking about more. They're even talking about the replacement for Dreadnought in 2050. So what that signals is we're going to be making a lot of the most expensive, the most exquisite, because a nuclear-powered submarine and armed submarine has to be exquisite. How do we apply some of the sort of economies of scale and economies indeed if so much is going into that particular world, which again to people like us journalists, it's the least scrutinised as well, and rightly so. But you know yourself that anything that is budgeted in the MOD as nuclear is suddenly sort of out of bounds. So how are we going to cope with that issue?
It's a really difficult one, but we have to. And I quite liked Rowley Walker's 20-40-40 approach to life, where the exquisite bits of kit is the smallest part of the entire holistic equation. But shifting that mindset and that culture away from what's the most exquisite big bit of kit I can put on parade to something that is actually more about more useful in war fighting is something that's got to be done. So I genuinely think a generational change, a culture change is necessary to make this work.
And it's back to that risk point. We've hidden behind a regulator's mindset for decades, because it's always easy to go, oh, I'm not sure about that. Health and safety, in the broadest sense of it. So our air weapons, as you said, take years to clear onto our aircraft, and then we life them to fly 10 sorties, and then we have to get rid of them. Well, in peacetime, and because as you say, you can go, but this is important, it's defence. We can take that easy way out. We can't afford to do that anymore. So I think across the board, to expand it slightly, because other than within AUKUS, we're not going to be selling too many nuclear submarines, but across defence material, I think we realise what Ukraine is showing us. It's the people and the ideas that are the important bit, and as long as the machines are good enough. But we've inverted that in the last X decades. We chase the machines, and it's that last 5 or 10% of exquisite capability which does two things. One, it costs you the fortune, 50% cost increases to get that last bit of performance. Secondly, you can't then sell it overseas or export it. And that means your production numbers are low, therefore the unit costs go through the roof, and down it spirals down. You need to reverse that spiral. So you need to be building for French do this better than us. I think you'll agree, Kevin.
Absolutely agree.
We need to build for export. We're therefore making them in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds. We can export them. We keep production lines going, and that combined gives us a much greater and I would say resilient industrial base. Whereas at the moment it's the equivalent of we need to build a Toyota, not McLaren Formula One cars, two exquisite cars. That's it, cost a fortune. We need to be knocking things out by the lorry load.
NATO summit is coming up and will take place in the Netherlands later this month. In your view, Kevin, what signal does this SDR send to our allies?
So firstly, I was glad to see it also said not only NATO first, but it didn't mean NATO only. Explicitly called out the cooperation with our EU partners in terms of both military cooperation, but also across the defence industrial base. So that's important. Potentially another source of money through the SAFE instrument, soft loans for 150 billion that we hope to access later in the year. But I think clearly this announcement and the timing is meant to provide a softer lead-in to the NATO summit, where quite clearly the SecGen is going to be demanding a much higher figure than we're prepared to spend at the moment. And so it will be very interesting to see how this announcement is going to play out, both with NATO as a whole, but also Donald Trump, who is attending the summit, is inevitably going to have a disruptive effect on proceedings, as he has done on pretty much everything else we could name.
Ed?
But I think our allies will welcome it, but they will immediately say, where's the beef? So they will want to see some of the concrete evidence that these reforms are here to stay and are meaningful. So I think we probably want to think through how, and the two international agents would be, we've mentioned them already, the National Armaments Director. And if we had that big beast to sit down with his or her fellows overseas, that would be a good sign. And military strategic headquarters that started working with with NATO and allies, especially in the GEF, about what do shared war plans look like, and then work back from that, and that would have real world implications across the defence industrial base. And I think when you see that happening, our allies will know that we're serious.
Coming back to the exquisite platforms point, I mean, one possibility, and it is only that, is international cooperation across some of these very big, very expensive platforms, and call out GCAP possibly, because the FCAS, the European equivalent of that, is in trouble, frankly. And is there some room for some collaboration, as we've done with Typhoon, and as we've done with AUKUS and GCAP itself? So, those are some possibilities that might help. But the where's the beef is a good question to ask around this whole SDR.
So here's let's fly a kite. If FCAS, SCAF, whatever is in trouble, and notwithstanding the normal international practices and sovereign worries, if you had those two programs, GCAP and FCAS, chasing essentially the same thing, a manned sixth-generation fighter, however you want to doll it up, well, there's a lot to be said for those who are looking at the way artificial intelligence is going, who are saying, by the time the manned fighter comes in, it might well now be technologically obsolete. So how much effort is going into GCAP and a troubled SCAF? Why not split that between one manned fighter and one hedging project, given that the Americans are building NCAD, that actually builds the AI equivalent, even to prove, well, maybe the tech or the software isn't quite there yet, but it is going to be in 5 years' time by the time this thing is flying. And if you were prepared to share the risk across that, and say from both these programs we will all buy into them, so we'll buy the manned fighter and we'll buy the unmanned version as well, you could then, that would be a massive international signal that we were all in this together. But it would rather upend some of the commercial relationships we have at the moment and the relationships that governments have with their national primes. I think such an idea would make quite a lot of people nervous.
Yeah, look, the mechanism of NATO being supplied with its military capabilities through the lens of the national country entries is challenging in terms of interrupting that cycle. But these are eye-wateringly expensive capabilities, and individual countries can only afford tiny numbers of these things versus adversaries like China.
But the history is, you go back, I appreciate the time here, but the history about Second World War or through aerospace, actually some real advances happened when companies could do what seemed to be a little bit too far, and suddenly it worked, and the next thing you know, they're the biggest sellers, whether it's your Mosquito in the Second World War or whether it's your F-16.
Yep.
The Air Ministry at the time thought that both of those wouldn't fly, as it were, and then look at them. So I think this is a case for let's be a bit adventurous.
And Ed, just on this question of enhanced UK participation in NATO's nuclear mission, for the layperson, can you explain what that might mean?
Yes, and I welcome that in the SDR. And I did write a blog on this, you can find it online, called The UK is Strangely Reluctant Nuclear Power, because we've always been quite ambivalent about it. We know we want to be a nuclear power for deterrence, but we also believe in multilateral disarmament. So we have parked the CASD, continuous at-sea deterrent, and said, because we've got that, we have now taken the nuclear question off the table, and we can concentrate on what is sort of morally and ethically easier to consider conventional warfare. Well, our enemies don't think that way, and Ukraine has made that absolutely clear. And our allies don't think that way either. We can talk about America, but it's a scale different.
I mean, the British don't even have the concept of a tactical nuclear weapon. They won't talk about it.
No, and 10 different military philosophers around this table will give you 10 different opinions on that. I think I'd sway to it's difficult to conceive what a tactical nuclear weapon is, because as soon as someone explodes a nuclear weapon, you've shifted the whole politics of the entire conflict. So there's always a strategic statement in that. But nevertheless, the Russians have always had a concept of how to do it. And for the French, that they are a nuclear power is much more at the core of their military sense. They start with being a nuclear power, then everything else flows from that. So what this will mean for us is now thinking through, just as, say, US Strategic Command does, we won't necessarily have all the materiel. I'm not suggesting that the Air Force goes back into having a tactical nuclear bomb. But there is the whole of the US military, and especially those involved in things to do with US Strategic Command, are steeped in escalation theory, escalation dominance, how you would deploy nuclear weapons, and other nations in NATO, their aircraft, for example, called DCA, dual capable aircraft, and all of
and
that.
The bombs are on hand, aren't
and the bombs are on hand, so they could go on German aircraft, they could go on other NATO aircraft. All that has been to increase the difficulty of your enemy, in this case assumed to be Russia, and being able to calculate what your response would be, and therefore that's all part of being able to get involved in the business of escalation dominance. We need to relearn what we've forgotten about that.
Listening to that, there's a very interesting comment which I was struggling to get my head around, but I now understand. In the SDR, it says something like, we've got to educate civilians and politicians in what you just described, escalation theory. It's so hard because we have, as you say, parked the strategic nuclear deterrent in such a way that most people never think about it. Most members of the public don't think about it. And I think just getting people to understand the reason why we might need a different set of options is because the adversary has those options, and we might need to deter anyone ever using one of those options. You've got to be able to show that you could do something in response. Is that basically the argument?
Yes, it's a core part of it. Even in the Cold War, when I could have gone had I gone to a different type of aircraft, I would have sat on a nuclear weapon for a few years. But even there, our exercises tended to last a couple of weeks, and the assumption was that you had either stopped the Russian invasion across the inner German border in its tracks, or somewhere towards the end, so you would practice a nuclear bit, things went nuclear, but then we said, well, that's it, it's got nuclear now, so there won't be any more conventional stuff. Well, that's not the way the Russians think. They fight through it. They might use that to cow you. They might put a demonstration. They might throw a nuclear weapon against a purely naval task force way out to sea and say, well, it was nothing to do with attacking the population. That is a pure maritime tactical nuclear operation. What are you going to do now in the West? And they would carry on fighting. I did write a paper in this in my last job, that as you introduced me, Director General Defence Academy, because it occurred to me that running all of those very senior courses, higher command and staff course, for example, the baby generals course, that we just didn't discuss nuclear weapons at all.
And do you think that at the upcoming NATO summit, I doubt whether it will be done publicly, but will the start of this discussion with NATO about enhanced collaboration with the nuclear mission, will that be on the agenda somewhere?
I'm sure it will be an undertow.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it will be on the agenda so overtly, because as we discussed, President Trump is going to be there.
Yep.
No one wants to use this as a lever which would separate and cleave European NATO from the Americans. But European political leaders have been talking about the European deterrent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a topic in German and French discourse, as you know, writing for your magazine. And so that's going to be one of those undertow peripheral conversations that will seep through the, no doubt, quite straightforward communiques that come out officially. But yeah, everybody in Europe will be thinking about it. And I would argue that, go back 10 years when we were going to Japan, I just sensed the Japanese were starting to think about this, given the rise of China, and just wondering, do we need to have something beyond an absolute 100% dependence on the American nuclear umbrella, or do we need to provide, a little bit of a parasol of our own?
This is truly fascinating, and there's so much to unpack, and I'm sure we will be doing this in the upcoming days, so please stay tuned. But just to end this conversation, I guess the one final question: what can we learn from the previous strategic defense reviews?
Well, I was somewhere the other day and they introduced this defence review by saying George Robertson's famous for the previous one, everyone liked the previous one, but only half of it was ever implemented. The problem is always in the implementation, and there were some serious people who put it together, and I think they have given some thought to the implementation, but the implementation has to be owned by the whole of government. If it isn't, the SDR will be overtaken quite quickly.
I'd say two things. One is the previous defence reviews have also all promised efficiencies. There are some numbers here in terms of transferring back office posts into the front line and other efficiencies that will come out of improvements in productivity. So we really have to go after those, and somebody has got to be accountable for delivering those, because that does open up more avenues for success. And then secondly, as Ed said, we genuinely have to focus on execution. Industry has a saying, execution beats Trump's strategy. And that is so true.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Ed, for joining us today and recording this podcast and sharing your insights. And thank you so much to all our listeners for listening to Defence Talk Securing UK Advantage, brought to you by Council on Geostrategy in partnership with ADS and sponsored by BAE Systems.